I'm really honoured to be moderating such a distinguished panel of guests. First of all, and never has the saying, she needs no introduction, been true, because Jennifer's already presented. So Jennifer Mcelvee is a Toronto City Councillor and serves as chair of the Infrastructure and Environment Committee. Joining her on the panel, we've got Peter Dorr, who is Interim Assistant Director of Environment and Energy, Head of Climate Change at the Greater London Authority. Peter is responsible for the development of the Mayor's environment and energy programmes and the Green New Deal. Roy Pinnock is a partner specialising in contentious and non-contentious planning law at one of the world's leading law firms, Dentons, with wide experience, including on a number of the most significant regeneration projects in the UK. Isabel Smith leads the Net Zero Building and Cities team for Atkins, UK. Isabel is responsible for developing the strategy for net zero and managing a team of engineers and designers to deliver net zero carbon solutions across the client portfolios for existing and new build developments. Jennifer, as you've already spoken very eloquently and very persuasively about Toronto, I was going to come back to you, but just to forewarn you what I'm going to come back to ask you about, I think I want to ask you about collaboration between cities across Canada and how you work together, given that carbon net zero isn't just a city by city thing, it's a kind of global objective for everyone. And I'd be interested to hear about how you work with other big and small cities across Canada to help them to deliver and for them to help you deliver net zero goals. But as we haven't heard directly from anybody in the London seat, as it were, yet, I thought I'd turn first to Peter to give his summary and account of what's happening in London. So Peter, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. That's I think the first time I've ever been described as part of a sandwich, and good to join you all. Sorry for being hidden there. I was scrambling around trying to figure out how to get off my camera working there. Yes, so just to give you a flavour of what we're up to, the Mayor of London has been re-elected in March. And it sounds as though you've covered some of our sort of climate ambitions already, but he was re-elected on a mandate to move forward our net zero ambitions from 2050 to 2030. So we're certainly not short of ambition here in London. That is a 30 million tonne challenge for us at the moment. So just thinking of our direct emissions, we have about 38% of our emissions are from domestic properties, homes, about a quarter from transport, and the rest is from sort of industry, business, and sort of municipal buildings as well. In terms of our approach then to that, we are, as you can imagine, at the moment updating our modelling, which was based on 2050 to 2050, to 2030. But in fact, yeah, many of the actions we need to take remain the same. It's just really the scale and the pace at which we need to do that has changed. Some of the things we have underway and we've had a great deal of success with are around using the planning system in London. So we have, we're the only UK city at the moment to have requirements around carbon neutral development in place for homes and non-domestic properties. And where that can't be achieved at the strategic scale, so the types of applications that the Mayor receives, then developers can offset the remaining, and that's raised in fact about £90 million worth of investment to support the boroughs in delivering their own sort of climate agendas over the last three years. In terms of transport, we're making good progress. We have around about 30% of all of the UK's electric charging points at present. We have the largest electric bus fleet of anywhere in Europe. So currently 500 electric buses, and that's going to increase to 800. So about 10% of our entire bus fleet, with ambitions to scale that up by 2030 as well. Just in terms of retrofit, that's a really, really big issue for us, as I've sort of mentioned. So we have about 1.7 million homes to retrofit to get to that carbon neutral target. We have a range of accelerator programs which are looking to sort of speed up delivery in that sector. So we have a public sector retrofit decarbonisation program called Refit, which is really giving support to building owners in the municipal sector and the public sector primarily, giving them technical support around sort of procurement and delivery of those deals. We've also got something similar with regards to social housing in play, which is looking to really aggregate and scale up that pipeline of activity as well. Then just finally, because I don't want to take up too much time, I could whittle on for hours. In terms of renewables and local energy, we've just put in place a £6 million local energy accelerator program, which again is looking to really bring forward and support both in the private and public sector commercially viable projects around district heating and also local energy, so things like solar and heat pumps as well. I'll maybe just stop there. I think that's probably enough of a flavour to start.
It is, Peter, and I think I'm not going to prejudice Jennifer by being the only one who comes back to ask her about collaboration between cities, because I know, well, as everyone will appreciate, as I sit here in Birmingham in my house, that there's competition between UK cities as well, but it's trying to establish whether that competition can be healthy and for the benefit of everyone. So that would be something I'd like to come back to you about as well, in terms of what the GLA is doing with other cities and urban areas in the UK. So turning then to Roy, and Roy, a planning lawyer with excellent experience, including on certainly one of the biggest schemes in London, which has been going on for a long time. Roy, could you talk a bit about what you do and the sort of planning challenges and all that sort of thing around getting a city the size of London to carbon net zero? Because I know that planning is always, in every project in the UK, but particularly those in London, a really tricky area.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Nicholas. We've got a real benefit in London because we've got a strategic plan, and so unlike a lot of places in the UK, I mean, London is almost unique in having a regional planning, and that was a political choice that was made over 10 years ago to get rid of the regional tier of planning. And when we look at things like biodiversity net gain, when we look at these huge strategic goals around what are major changes to the way that we live our lives and the way that we not just build our buildings, retrofit our buildings, but where we put places and how we assemble land uses, how we master plan, having a regional spatial strategy makes a difference. And I think the work that Pete and others have done is really impressive, and having that political commitment has made a great deal of difference. So the leadership that there is politically has flowed through into a recently adopted London plan, as Pete said, and the way that policy has been nudged through over the past few years before the plan was actually adopted. The Mayor's been fairly assertive about how some of those draft policies have needed to be implemented, and there's been a degree of tapering in some of the metrics that are used. So we talked, Pete, I think, mentioned the shortfall payments that you get, where buildings are brought forward through the planning system, through the zoning system, to get approval, where they fall short of the net zero for residential and other targets for commercial, then they pay a shortfall payment. Now, the metrics that are used for that have changed and are continuing to change, and not least the price per carbon tonne. And one of the big incentives for people to try and get through the system has been the fact that that's gone from 60 to I think £95 per carbon tonne, and that makes a big difference in a scheme that's been priced in a slightly different market. So the London plan approach and the hierarchy approach and the cascade, it's got, I think people correct me, but it's be seen, where you've got be lean, be seen, do other things, is effectively it's about hierarchy. In the same way that in policy terms, we're also moving towards a much clearer hierarchy for things like biodiversity net gain. So it's not just the outcome, it's about looking at the way that schemes are being designed and put together to try and reduce at source. And that hierarchy, I think, is a really important policy concept, not just for net zero, but for other things as well. because it's by channeling people into operating on the basis of having to sort of try and jump through the hoops in a particular way that we begin to get those outcomes baked into the way that people approach not just scheme design, but the way they approach land acquisition, which is basically, and master planning, which is really the sort of key challenge. One of the bugbears for me slightly is it's not always been really clear to me what the offset payments that you actually pay are, and they can be really big numbers. They are very broadly described in the agreements that we have here, the planning agreements, which secure these often multi-million pound contributions. There is a big chunk of them that's gone into school retrofit programs. There's a chunk of them that's gone into what are effectively fuel poverty initiatives. And there is some good guidance from the Greater London Authority, from the Mayor, on how the London boroughs who make up the Mayor's strategic area should implement their own carbon offsetting scheme. But my slight bleat is really that they don't really have enough teeth. It's not really clear how that money is being spent. There may well be good stuff being done in the background. The ultimate measure of success should be that schemes come forward and don't pay any contribution. And the really crucial thing that we have to do as practitioners is to help interpret policy so that it's clear when people buy land and when they put schemes together that they're actually going to work at the stage they hit the political determination. But secondly, that there's proper incentives for people through the lifetime of that scheme, recognising that consenting is only one part of the development process. Actually getting a consent, amending those consents, building those schemes, living with the life cycle of that scheme, coming back and actually being incentivised to engineer in improvements as technologies improve, so that those catch-up payments can be reduced if the scheme's fabricated in a better way. The last thing I was just going to say, to take up a couple more seconds, was really I think there has to be a much clearer approach to transitional schemes. So schemes that spend years in the planning application process can go in at one level, having been designed to deal with a certain set of carbon offset metrics, but they can take so long to get through the system, 3 or 4 years, due to factors beyond their own control, that you end up with a completely different set of metrics applying. And we need to have much more clarity about that and the circumstances in which those will be kind of throttled back potentially. But I think, as Nick, I think you said that the game is afoot, and London's, I think, been a real leader in that. But the cities like Oxford and elsewhere that are certainly doing their bit. And I think there are some really interesting things which are around the master planning and land use, not just building fabrication, because that's a really crucial thing as we look at the strategic land. How are we actually going to plan large communities, which is really an important issue, not just for London, but for the rest of the UK, and do that in a way that it's not just building fabrication, but it's actually the master planning process that builds those 20-minute neighbourhoods and actually gets uses in the right places to compress the carbon budget in the first place.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Well, I was going to say, in terms of planning, and having only stopped being a lawyer 2 months ago, I can't help being a lawyer. I was thinking about things in a lawyer kind of way, but the stuff which now goes into planning permissions, isn't there, which is very targeted at kind of green outcomes, if you like. So you get a requirement for vehicle charging infrastructure to be built into new builds and all that sort of stuff. There are lots of those other bits, or I don't know, with heating schemes and that. But is that common across all planning, or is that just me having heard something which isn't strictly correct?
No, that's right. I mean, the district heat network kind of requirements, to the requirement to plug your scheme into district heat network, they're kind of there. It's very difficult where you've got a scheme coming forward you can build the requirements usually, and certainly in a London context, are to be capable of connection. And so there's been tussles historically around what that means. The reality is there's not that many heat networks that are really coming forward. There are a few. They've been pretty slow to come forward in reality. And so actually having the capability where on an area-wide basis people really plug in, that remains, I think, one of the big challenges. And the things like electric vehicle charging points, I mean, they are becoming much more the norm. It's still something, again, where if you have a scheme that's been master planned and which has been in development for several years, and it then has a requirement for electric vehicle charging points shoved in, you can argue that people should have anticipated that. It also includes incorporates a really big cost impact on that scheme, and you are going to have biodiversity net gain requirements, EV charging points, increasingly ambitious carbon savings. They're all exactly the right things to be doing. What we've got to be careful about is how much transparency there is in doing that in a time frame that means that land acquisitions can actually adjust to it, and is there enough value in the land to allow those to be brought forward.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Roy. And I'm going to come back to you and say, well, in Birmingham, we get our low vehicle emission zone comes into force in 2 days' time. But I want to come back and ask all the panelists, including you, Jennifer, about this question of equity or equality, how potentially, I think you alluded to it, Jennifer, a bit in your earlier talk, which is how you don't exclude people. And London is interesting because there's a kind of move out from the centre, I think, and the very centre becomes more expensive. So if you've got vehicle charging or low emission zones, that can prejudice less affluent members of society, if that's a way of putting it. So I'd be interested in your views on how you manage to deliver carbon net zero in a major urban area equitably, so you're not mistreating or treating inequitably the poorer members of society. But I don't want to leave Isabel sitting there silently forever. So Isabel, your thoughts on and your on the built environment, and that's your area of focus. So
yeah, thanks, Nick.
Take the floor. Yeah, pleasure.
Yeah,
and I see. So I was just going to say, Isabel, I see your backdrop is completely opposite of Roy, which is the City of London, and you've got a beautiful beach or something.
Yeah, aligned to the SNC Lavalin corporate background. So, no, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try and answer kind of questions and thoughts raised so far through the lens of a kind of designer and a consultant. We've talked quite a lot about the role of cities, but I had a few more facts I wanted to add into the mix, if that's okay. So, the World Bank estimates that 80% of our economic activity occurs in cities. And there was research undertaken last year that shows that smart cities have the potential to generate $20 trillion of economic benefit by 2026 alone. And globally, it's estimated that 68% of the population are expected to live in cities by 2050, which is 6.5 billion people. So it just kind of puts that in perspective a little bit. And whilst most of that rapid urbanization will occur in kind of Asia and Africa, and we saw from the slides earlier that Carlos sent, but UK cities will still see that growth, even in that post-COVID world. Given that the UK is already heavily urbanized, with over 90% of our population living in urban spaces, we must remember that the vast majority of the physical infrastructure that will exist in 2050 already exists today. And as such, innovation should be focused on our approaches to retrofitting the existing building stock and infrastructure, as well as how we integrate into the smart new build assets, systems and neighbourhoods of the kind of near to mid-term future. So I live in London, not ignoring my background, where I see firsthand that it really is at the forefront of the campaign to net zero. And it was great to hear that in more detail today, Pete. But around the world, we see cities being leaders on our route to net zero. And I think cities are interesting because they pose probably the greatest challenges for carbon reduction. But I think there's a real takeaway that we should take from today, which is that they're also where we'll find the greatest gains and innovation, and that's so exciting. So from an innovation perspective, I think there's much more that needs to be done, and I could talk for hours. But in the time I have here, the three areas that I thought should be raised to really kind of allow that whole systems approach to net zero, which is so fundamental. Firstly, I thought that innovation needs to be focused on ensuring that real world and implementable solutions can be deployed at scale. So proactively addressing sustainability, cost and security trilemma that will emerge as smart cities become increasingly interconnected. And one key area that requires serious innovation is grid scale storage. Suffice to say that innovating to deliver resilience will also be key. Secondly, enabling technologies and digital infrastructure. So none of the smart systems, new energy solutions, emerging technologies that will be required to drive a more efficient and resilient city of the future will realize their potential without foundational enabling technologies in place. So 5G, AI, cloud, edge computing, all technologies that are rapidly developing and will likely represent the enabling technologies for resilient integration of city-scale solutions across energy, transport, and building systems. But innovating in this space is to best utilize these to develop national and city kind of digital twins will likely be a defining moment in that journey. And lastly, my area, so buildings and construction. So decarbonising the building sector may be one of the most cost-effective ways to mitigate climate change, and I'd be here, really keen to hear other people's opinions on that. But given that 70% of the buildings that exist in 2050 already exist today, decarbonising our building stock is essential. And in London, this presents a really fascinating challenge. We have such a complex and rich history, and I'm sure it's the same in Toronto. That spans centuries that must be protected throughout our citywide retrofit works. And that hierarchy that Roy mentioned also spans to retrofit. So looking at optimizing our estates through evaluating how we use spaces will ensure that major retrofit and new build construction is reduced only to the essential interventions. How do we kind of sweat the assets that we've already got in the city first? And our climate will continue to change for many decades, and it's still reacting to the impacts of the last few millennia. So using digital twins to simulate future climate and scenario test technologies and interventions will ensure that whilst we're doing all of this retrofit, we're doing it for a changing climate, so that will allow us to create cities that emerge net zero and adapted for that new climate, which is really important. In relation to new builds, it's kind of the easy bit in some ways. And we see innovation around kind of mass offsite manufacturing, and most importantly, its standardization as being key to revolutionizing the construction sector whilst we still decarbonize it. So yeah, that was my thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I did have a question which came to me when Carlos was speaking earlier, and if anybody's got a view on it, which you've brought to mind as well, Izzy, which is this question of innovation, real cutting edge innovation. So before I joined government, I was advising a couple of firms. One was dealing a lot with mine heat technology in another UK city. So using mine heat for district heating. That was one quite innovative. I won't say very innovative. And then another one who was doing wave energy. And those things are really, those technologies, and a bit like hydrogen, although hydrogen's becoming a little bit more, kind of moved up the agenda quite a lot. But where you need funding for those things, they're not particularly necessarily attractive investment opportunities. They're kind of, at the borders of venture capital, if that, often. So it's how you manage to create policy or provide funding where there's not necessarily an expectation that you're going to get a return immediately, but it has a real benefit or prospective benefit for society. So I'd be interested in any of those. But anyway, Jennifer, you've been sitting there quietly waiting, and so I'd be interested to hear, coming back to my question about collaboration between cities and towns and municipalities and all that.
Well, there's a few different forums that we have. So the first is the big cities mayor caucus. So, Mayor Tory does meet regularly with the biggest municipalities in Canada. And of course, environmental sustainability is something that everyone finds important. I'm sure is a very important agenda item every time. But we also have the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. And so we have councillors from Toronto, councillors from every municipality that sit on that. And that's also a good forum for exchange and discussion. Part of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is the Green Municipal Fund. And I think that's really the key part here, because it's about financing. And so this is a fund that has, I think it's about $1 billion, and it's the interest that's used for grants and loans out to Canadian municipalities for their climate action. And there's a new program through that was funded by the federal government called the Low Carbon Cities Initiative. So 7 centers across Canada, including Toronto, the Toronto Atmospheric Fund, receive financing that they can then use on projects and loans. And they have a peer-reviewed granting system that does that. And for the smaller municipalities that aren't part of one of the 7 centers, there is the community efficiency financing program as well. So there's something for everybody. But GMF Council is, I have the pleasure of sitting on it. The chair is from Edmonton. So there's always interesting discussions about how we can share the information in those pilot programs. It is published publicly so others can learn from it and then take some of the best learnings of that and apply them into their own city. So we have multiple forums, and of course C40 is another one. Montreal, Vancouver, also parts of that, and we're working together on Women for Climate with them as well.
Yeah, and Jennifer, so I worked a little bit in Canada, and I worked in the Canadian law firm for quite a few years as well. So I got a sense of it. But one of the sense I got is, unless you've engaged with Canada a bit, you don't get it. But there's quite a diversity of views across the country, between different provinces and all that. And for example, so I'd bring out Calgary, but maybe that's unfair. But there's Calgary and Toronto are possibly very different cities. And how do you, if you see one city behaving in a way or having an attitude which isn't consonant with yours, how would you convince Calgary, or how would Calgary convince you? How does that work across the federation?
Well, I think that's certainly old Canada. I think there's been big strides and big changes. So the chair of the Green Municipal Fund is a councillor from Edmonton, and climate action is very important to him. Likewise, Mayor Nenshi in Calgary, is very committed to climate action as well. I think we're seeing that cities want to live differently, want to live more sustainably. But certainly, you're correct that previous to the federal government we have right now, it wasn't an agenda item to have a federal policy on climate action. And, I think the US is a good example of what happens there. So under President Trump, there was no action, but Mayor Garcetti from LA got out there and said, even in the absence of action in the White House, LA is all in and continue to make those strides. We did see that as well under our previous government. They weren't as committed to climate action, but cities still stepped up. Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal all took big strides. We now have, I feel, Calgary, Edmonton coming along as well. There is one of those low carbon cities hubs in Calgary that will be having this innovative financing as well. And of course, now our federal government has committed to be net zero. So I think we'll finally have that federal strategy. But you're exactly right that municipalities, in the absence of federal strategies, still need to keep charging forward.
Yeah, brilliant. That's an excellent answer. So, and Pete, from a GLA point of view, what collaboration do you have across the UK? And I'm kind of interested as well, and this maybe came out slightly in Carlos's slides, is collaboration between cities in the UK and cities in emerging economies. How we collaborate with them, how we deliver our lessons learned, not just within in our countries, but also around the world. Because I know, for example, Canada and the UK are both leading countries in public-private partnerships, so can set an example which can be driven towards carbon net zero. But Pete, what's the position between GLA and other, for example, northern cities in the UK or in Scotland and so on?
Thanks, Nick. I'll deal with the international one first. So London set up the C40 quite a few years back now, and that still remains our sort of our key way of sharing best practice and engaging with now close to 100 cities. Never put a number of cities in your name as a lesson. I think C40. It's been a lot bigger than that for quite some time. So, that sort of partnership is really, really valuable. It provides the sort of space for cities to engage honestly and openly with each other about the things that went well, but also the things that haven't gone particularly well. And those lessons are really, really important to share. And there's a whole range of different networks underneath C40 where we sort of engage actively cities in the global north and the global south. I mean, in terms of the UK, it's interesting, Nick, you mentioned that question because, as you know, there's a sort of big discussion around national priorities around what's being called levelling up at the moment, which is very much about sort of investing in the north of the country, to the detriment of places like London, is the perspective some people put in on it. But I think that we are engaged with something called the M10, which is the metropolitan city mayors across the English region, then with the capitals of the other parts of the UK, so Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And I think we have a very shared and joint interest in making the case for the benefits of investing in city and how they actually benefit the wider regions and parts of the UK. So an example we use is around bus electrification in London, which is actually driving hundreds of millions of pounds of local economy up in Yorkshire and Ballymena, places like this. We use the M10 as a way to try and get a very controlling centralist government to Peter Ellis's point, I think, in the chat, to devolve more powers locally and funding to allow us to do more in cities and at local authority regions. And I think we have a really good track record where we're able to do that. Roy talked very nicely, thank you, Roy, about the London plan and the impact of that. Other examples would be the congestion charge or the ultra low emission zone in London, where we made significant impacts where we have the powers to do it. And I think there's a conversation that we as a group of metropolitan cities are very keen to have with government, and COP26 is a good opportunity for us to do that.
Brilliant, thank you, Peter. And I'm interested, Roy, and you alluded to it a little bit. Well, you alluded to it a lot. But what do you think? I mean, the really concrete measures of success. I mean, obviously planning is part of it, and then I think obviously, Isabel, your work as well is a big part of it as well. What would be the measures of a successful road to carbon net zero, or that you're on the road? I mean, one hopes you'll get there eventually, but how do you know you're on the right track, and how does one respond? And this could go in both ways. It can either go in a kind of legal aspect, or it can go in a policy aspect, political aspect, or it can go in a building technology, which I think is really interesting. How do you set a track and know that you're on the right track, but then how do you change track as, for example, new research about climate change comes out, or new technologies emerge which displace old technologies? I mean, I can think possibly rather ill-fatedly that everyone was told to buy diesel cars, and then we were all told diesel cars were really bad. But that's a bad example. But I
handed mine back. Yeah, it was pretty bad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are the measures for success, and what's the signposts which tell you that you're on the right road, and how do you capture those?
I go back to what I said before. I think the real measure of success is that there's no offset payments. That we've got master plans, which the land budget and the uses in it, whether they're at big scale, small scale, that they are done in a way which means that we don't have shortfalls against the net zero objectives. And that's a function both of, for the larger schemes, the way that they're designed from a master planning point of view in terms of what land uses are in there and how we use green infrastructure to achieve certain offsetting objectives, and actually design our buildings now and our places to be lower emitters and work on delivering on that hierarchy. But in the going back to what Isabel was talking about, we make sure those building technologies, that there's clear economic incentives to really push those technologies hard, because as those economic incentives exist through policy, that's when those technologies will be taken up and pushed harder. We can sweat the assets, but let's provide an economic incentive to actually make the technology used. But I mean, I think ultimately it will be a position where we're not paying cash to offset those schemes. But I do think that what we will see with both net zero and things like biodiversity net gain is movement over time, and you know, those objectives should just get harder over time, basically, and the metrics that we're using for those things should just get a bit more challenging over time. And I think we've come a really long way just in probably in my own experience, probably in the last sort of 4 years or so, in terms of people, where those schemes are approaches. How those costs can be borne by those projects is a really important part. And if we go too hard in terms of tightening the screw on those standards and those metrics, then we're going to end up with schemes which are struggling with viability and end up with a legitimacy issue for development, because the issue that we have, certainly in the UK, is very much that where costs are ladled onto these schemes, the thing that suffers because of the UK delivery mechanism for affordable housing, social housing, is that that's regarded as the movable part. That creates controversy in determining those schemes at zoning, at planning stage, and then that leads to challenges in getting those schemes through and in the social license to actually build. So we've got to be very careful about how quickly we turn the screw on these, how quickly those metrics are adopted, and be very clear about what the transitional periods are, so that when you're buying land and you're proposing to do development, you can factor that into the pricing.
Yeah. And Izzy, on the kind of, sorry, just very briefly, boy. I mean, one thing obviously we experience in this country, and I'm sure it's not exclusive to this country, but it's kind of seems peculiarly British thing, is that planning takes absolutely years to get through. So can you have a planning system which is responsive? So in my line of work as a lawyer, I did a lot of PPP projects, and they were kind of 25-year projects, and you kind of set an output specification, which is this. And you can see it, for example, in the schools estate, or particularly in the built environment, where there are PPPs, where the output kind of is 25 years. It's the same, and it's really expensive to change it and flex it. Is there any way you can flex planning as you go along to move with the times?
You can see that as the picture I like sharing about the planning system.
Okay.
I've probably seen this one before, but this is what people come up with in order to do what we're trying to do commercially or trying to meet needs, and everyone's got a different take on it. Whether you're the engineer, you're the policy maker, and in policy terms, it's the implementation gap, isn't it? It's the Jennifer, is trying to achieve something for her electors. She's got her priorities. You've got policy making on the other side. You've got money and basically capital being deployed. How do we get to a position where they're all seeing the same drawing? And for me, that's the successful part of the planning system here. Should be where through engagement you get to a stage where actually we're seeing the same drawing quite early in the development process, and you're not getting disappointment or undeliverability or unfeasibility creeping in further down the line. But it's still, it's still a massive problem in terms of that gap in expectations. And I think, that will persist. One of the interesting things about all the chat that's been happening in the UK about going to a zonal system or, coming away from the discretionary planning system that we've had is that actually it takes a really long time to put zonal stuff into place. If you look in Sweden, they decided they've been through rounds and rounds of looking at ways of changing the planning system. And then decided that, well, to be honest, it just takes ages to put the zoning stuff in place anyway, and it takes ages to put a really big planning application in place. Maybe these things just take time. And actually, I think it's about getting the dialogue right so that people don't feel cheated about that time process, but their expectations are set. And we don't get to an end result, which is someone got refused and they've wasted all that time when that scheme could have come forward. Yeah,
that's brilliant. That's right. And Isabel, in terms of kind of dynamism in building materials and building design and all that stuff, and given that quite often big infrastructure projects are very long in conception and long in building, and then sit around and are used for minimum of 25 years, how do you deal with a dynamic response to environmental designs and demands in your space?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and I think that there's parts of it which are, you mentioned kind of like demonstrating that measure of success, and I think that, I guess what we've spoken about so far is quite quantifiable, and I agree with Roy that true net zero would be no offset, and I think it would help globally if we had a clearer definition of what net zero really means. that's universal.
Yeah.
But then I think the other side of it is quite interesting is the kind of the softer benefits as well, and those successes. So how do we measure behavior changes and culture changes? They're much harder to measure, but potentially more important, because this isn't going to be static. It's going to keep shifting, and as you say, Nick, we're going to have to adapt. Planning policy will have to adapt. Our approaches will have to adapt. And is that easier to drive and maintain if that's a more universal behavior shift and cultural shift, rather than just concentrating on those quantifiable aims? And I think to partner that. Sorry, Nick. I was just going to say no, but just one last point on that though, which I think is quite interesting, and it's certainly something that we're seeing is, it feels to me as though carbon is being quite rapidly removed from the broader picture of sustainability, and that to me is always. I mean, I like carbon because you can measure it as an engineer. It feels kind of safe to me, but at the same time, I think we do have to be very mindful of the broader picture around climate adaptation, and it's really fascinating speaking to colleagues like around the world where their immediate concerns are quite different to what we see in the UK and probably in Canada as well. So is it more around climate adaptation to protect them from natural disasters, for example, rather than necessarily just decarbonising cities? And the two are very interesting, I think, to see that balance. And
And I was going to say, Jennifer, that it just reflecting on that point, Isabel, that's really interesting. And in terms of contracting models are very often based on outputs, but really what you're aiming for is an outcome. And if the outcome is mutable and and change, I mean, you kind of know the general direction of travel, which was one of my earlier questions. But how in Canada do you deal, and particularly in the context of, say, PPPs, and I think a lot of this will be PPP related because it is the public and the private sector and all working together. How do you deal with that kind of outcomes-based development in Canada?
Well, I mean, certainly we don't have a fast process either. So I wish I could claim that we did. I liked the picture of the tree, but I think we're struggling on the partnership side. There's a few things we need to think about. The first is that ideology cannot be more important than collaboration, and so I think that we are a country that is dependent on natural resources and was founded on natural resources. We do have a big oil and gas sector, but they also don't want to be out of work by 2050 either. So I think we need to start to look at how we can make that bridge and have them involved in this partnership and in this transition to the green economy, into this transition into net zero. We've seen there's huge risk in if you just take out the climate aspect of it and just look at it financially, there's huge risk in investing in continuing to invest in oil and gasoline. Biden just canceled a major pipeline project for us, right? Like it's not a sustainable industry anymore, and we need to bring them to the table with the partnerships. The same goes with the banking industries. Some people want to say the banks are inherently evil because they haven't divested in fossil fuels yet either. So I think this conversation of ideology overriding collaboration is very dangerous, and we certainly need to find ways to build those public partnerships, those public-private partnerships, and work together and come to the table together, because this is going to require everybody if we want to be successful.
Yeah, and it's interesting actually. At the very start of your first talk at the beginning of this whole session, and which is a peculiarly Canadian thing, is the mention of First Nations, which obviously is really important. And so you've got your business community, your financing community, your local just urban populations, and then you've also got to take along your First Nations bit as well. And I mean, does that have an effect? It's obviously has to be a consideration, but what's the impact of that?
Well, firstly, I do say we read that at the beginning of our meetings, but it's not lip service. Like I truly do believe it. I will say that my great grandmother was Indigenous, and so I understand this connection to Mother Earth, and I've read much about that. I've spoken with many First Nations peoples, and so they are our water keepers. They are the protectors of our environment. They have very interesting perspectives that we've not listened to in the way that we should. There is a lot of Indigenous knowledge about the way our natural systems work. There's examples of First Nations saying that Lake Ontario was in a different location generations ago, and then the geologists found out, oh, they were right, it was somewhere else. So we didn't take their learnings in the right way, and we're still trying to figure that out as we work together towards recognitions of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. And again, you're exactly right. So just like I think we need partnerships with industry, we need partnerships with First Nations, but they are definitely leading the charge in many respects in that area.
Yeah, and that partly comes back to my inclusivity point, which I think is really important, that everybody has to be taken on the journey. And it's not just Toronto and Toronto versus every other Canadian city. It's all Canadian cities plus all Canadian municipalities plus all communities. And it's the same in the UK as well. If everybody's not bought in, then you're going to take far longer to get to your goal, and possibly not get to your goal at all. That I guess is a truism. We're kind of running out of time now, but I really do want to ask a question for everyone, so everyone has a last say. A question I invented after I'd sent out my list of questions at the weekend, or things I thought we might need to address. So each of you has a different professional background, and looking across the panel, where do you think any of the other professions represented could improve their contribution to carbon reduction? So you can't speak for your own profession, that's it, but you can each pick on somebody else on the panel. So I guess I'll start with you, Pete, as you haven't spoken for a while.
I think Roy, in fairness, answered this quite well with the diagram and that description of the planning process, to be honest, which is getting a clearer agreement of where we're trying to get to early in the process. I think that applies to all of our professions. And that sort of long-term signal of where we're going is incredibly important in sort of setting that from the government perspective. So, planning system is very good at chopping and changing often. And I think we just need that long-term signal and that opportunity then to really focus on how we deliver that together. So,
yeah, brilliant. Okay. So Roy, nobody else can pick on Roy then. So Izzy, who would you can pick on Roy if you want. I don't mind you picking on other lawyers. That's fine.
Yeah, I think Pete's answer is a pretty good one. I was thinking of it more technically. I think particularly in the engineering world and design world, we need to have much more integration with skill sets which are going to be essential for this. And to me, that's around like coding and data science and data analysts. We've certainly seen a complete shift in the skills we expect in our graduates and in our hiring at the moment, where actually we're putting those skills at the forefront. At the end of the day, carbon is data, and it's certainly a skill that I think, particularly in the UK, we'll need to see big shifts in.
Yeah, and Roy, what's your who do you think can who would you pick on to improve their performance in carbon net zero?
It's one of the few areas where lawyers can't readily be blamed, so it's wonderful.
We can, Roy, don't worry.
But I not in a pejorative way. I think we look to politicians for leadership, and I think that the political classes, to the extent they even exist anymore, bear great responsibility for this great question that should face all of us, which is, what are we prepared to give from our today for someone else's tomorrow? Where is the sacrifice in our lives? And that's really the crucial question. And in a consumer society, it's so tempting never to ask yourself that. And we all as individuals have got that challenge that we've got to be prepared to give something from today for tomorrow. where that comes down to is you've got to have leadership from politicians ultimately, and that takes bravery. It does take courage to stick your neck out and put yourself on a platform. The Mayor of London has done that. He's offered one of his opposing candidates in this mayoral election said that he was going to get rid of the extension to the clean air zone, which is extended down just to where I live in South London. So there's a clear leadership there, which is do something or not do something, act or allow things to just persist. And that is the kind of leadership, the kind of things we talked about coalitions that Jennifer's talked about, which I think is wonderful. It's about city groups, coalitions, city regions actually working together in a way that demonstrates that leadership and makes something a new normal. And that really is the crucial thing. And then people like me can go off and document it and tell people they need to do it and they need to factor it into their land price and all the rest of it. Without that, we're sunk.
Brilliant. That's a fantastic answer, Roy. Thank you. So Jennifer, you get the final word. Apart from me, I get a final word after you. And then Simon gets one after me.
Well, I mean, certainly I've already called it the oil and gas industry. But I think the press communications, I think the one thing I've realized transitioning from being a scientist into a politician and seeing what we're doing at the City of Toronto is we're not getting the good story out either. People want to back a winner. They want to know we can do this. And we're not telling the successful stories. We're not showing those examples where people can see a solar panel on a paramedic station and see, hey, that looks great. That doesn't look terrible. I can put that on my home. That's easy. What does that involve? So I think there's a huge communication exercise that we need to go through. One, yes, we can always do more. But right now, I think we're stuck on that message. We're not telling the message of how much we've achieved. We're not showing how it's possible for people to be part of that. And I think there's the momentum coming, and we just need to get that good news story out there.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. That's a really excellent answer. Thank you, Jennifer. So I've run out of time to sum up, but I'm going to sum up really quickly, Simon. So I mean, I think it's such a fascinating subject, and I'm sure we could go on for another hour or so talking about different aspects of it. And I always feel I've kind of undersold everyone a little bit by not letting everyone speak for an hour each. But I mean, the fact is there are challenges, there are opportunities, and I think all of that comes together, and we can be optimistic, not least because of the kind of people who are on this panel, but we can be optimistic that if we work in partnership, we can achieve this. But it's a partnership which isn't just a partnership within a city, it's a partnership between cities, between countries, and between developed countries and emerging economies and all that sort of thing. So there are lots of reasons, but one thing that the pandemic has demonstrated to me, and certainly in the UK and elsewhere in the world, because I know it's kind of played out differently, marginally differently in different parts of the world, but that you can actually buckle down and achieve stuff together. And public-private partnerships, which I'm very passionate about, in as far as I'm passionate about this as well, can really work to deliver carbon net zero. So I kind of feel challenges, opportunities, but a great sense of optimism, and that's reinforced by everything that everybody said on this panel. So I'm really grateful to you all, and you're all so much more expert than me on these subjects, and I'm really proud to have been the moderator for this panel. So thank you all